Hello. Welcome. So we're moving on from Brahms to Schumann, as you know. It's probably well known that Schumann wrote in big, exuberant bursts, you know. He had a year of song, a year of chamber music. We're going to be looking at the year of chamber music. I have these notes to remind me that in 1840 he wrote 168 songs. And in 1841, he wrote 2 symphonies, a scherzo finale and a fantasy for piano and orchestra. And in 1842, in 6 months, he wrote his 6 best-known chamber works, including the piano quintet, immediately followed by the piano quartet, and before that, the 3-string quartets. He also had big periods of depression, and I'm not going to get into this too much, but just to get it out of the way, Schumann is the composer who is looked at by psychologists and psychiatrists as being the best and most likely true example of a bipolar genius. There are whole books on this. You know, K. Jamison Redfield, who is actually a friend of mine, has written some wonderful books about this, and there's one which gets into Schumann in great depth. So if you want to read about that, he's a really good case. I mean, he had also in his family, his father probably was bipolar, judging by the illnesses he had, and he had a sister who committed suicide, and it goes on and on. So I'm not going to get into that too much. Luckily for us, there is the exuberant Schumann who wrote all this great music. So what I'd like to do is just start with the first phrase of this piece, and it's not even the whole phrase, just the opening, if we may, and I'm going to then talk about that for 45 minutes. You think I'm kidding? Okay, here we go. Hold it. Okay, that's that. Right there, this is very important. Do that again, just stop right there, because this is not normally how one starts a movement. Go ahead. Okay, good. Now let me explain this. Does it need explanation? Well, think about it, though. How many pieces start in the midst of a thought? Now, what happens next? If this were Wagner, you know, then you would just transpose that. Maybe again. Maybe you would never know. You don't know where it's going to go. But let's look at it again. This chord should do this. Why are some of you laughing? Because it's all wrong, right? In other words, this is a diminished chord. That means it could go just about anywhere. Starting a piece with a diminished chord, it's not a whole piece, the movement, is very unusual. Schumann started lots of pieces with, lots of movements especially, and songs, with something that is in the midst of happening. Excuse me. You thought you'd sneak in there like that. But so if you and this is something that's good to know in case you ever hear something like the Piano Puzzlers, which is the radio show. If you lower any note of a diminished chord, you have a dominant chord. Now that means you could be in this key. I'm doing it again. Or it could be. It's neither of those, all right? Because what he does is. Now, we're still not ready to play this. The idea of starting in the middle is so important to Schumann that before we even get past that, I would like you to hear 2 short songs of his, which I'm going to, really a 2-minute song and another 2-minute song, which I'm going to talk about some of the harmonies because these are miniatures, and then we can get into this big complex thing. But speaking of Wagner and Schumann, they met. They only met once that I know of, and they both wrote about it. So I'm going to read you these 2 little encounters. Wagner wrote to Hanslick about meeting Schumann. Schumann is a highly gifted musician, but an impossible person. When I came here from Paris, I visited Schumann, told him of my Paris experiences, spoke of musical conditions in France, then of those in Germany, spoke of literature and politics, but he remained practically mute for almost half an hour. Well, you can't keep talking alone forever. He's an impossible person. Schumann wrote, Wagner is a very instructed and ingenious man, but he talks incessantly. And one can really not endure this in the long run. Who do you believe? Okay, that was fun. All right, now, a few examples of openings of music. Here's one of the most famous openings ever written by Schumann, and it's in not only how ambiguous and strange the opening phrase is, and then it still stays that way until the voice comes in this song. It's very strange. You don't know where you are exactly. And after you hear this, I'm going to deconstruct it for you a little bit. It has to do with memory, though, the way he makes you feel like you're in the midst of a thought, trying to remember something. This is from the first song of Dichterliebe. It's being sung by Ian Bostridge. Now, not only does it start out of nothing, but it doesn't end either. Of course, it goes on to another song. Now, I just want to spend a moment doing this because this is one of the best examples of Schumann's unusual openings that are so vague, so ambivalent, so ambiguous, and that seem to evoke the process of memory, which is something he became identified with. It's very dissonant, and so is the piece you're about to hear. This piano quartet is full of dissonances, and yet we think of it as extremely beautiful, which it is. But it's important to realize that dissonance and beauty often are very much linked. It depends on context. So the first two notes are these, in what you just heard. And the next note is, I'm slowing them down, but it's obviously this is a lot of dissonance already. This resolves, but this is still here. Then this resolves, but we don't get the whole chord till here. That's the root, that's the bottom of the chord up on top. So it starts with a note, and you think, because so much music up to this time will start with a note, that must be something like this. Or something where that note is the root, the third, the fifth of the chord, something. But here, we don't know what it is. And then we realize it's a suspended ninth. Now, you don't have to realize that consciously. But you realize that's another way of saying it doesn't belong there. And it resolves, and when it resolves, you think, there's a minor chord. But if you take a minor chord and put another minor third below it, you have a new chord. So what Schumann has done is take a dissonant pitch out of the air, build a chord slowly, not from the bottom up, but not in the right order of notes, resolve this note that's been hanging there, and then give you a note on top that is the root. And we still don't know what it is till here. Now, when he does it again, now we know what's happening. This time it's a little clearer. But it feels like it's stuck in a rut until the voice comes in And then we realize when the voice, which says in the wonderful month of May, when you realize that you're thinking of the wonderful month of May, at the moment that the singer has realized what he's thinking of, it changes key. Because the F sharp minor, the B minor, the things that are hovering around there, and the dissonant pitches, they're very unclear. And when the voice, with the poem, understands what the memory is, it's nice and simple A major. Here comes the voice. And then we get it. It's brilliant writing. And it is probably the first time in music, in general in Schumann's music, not just this song, that the feeling of searching for something happens at the very beginning of a song or a piece, rather than in the middle. It's so vague. When Beethoven was composing, to start a piece not on the chord of the key was already a shock. He did that only a few times. It was very strange. So this is very groundbreaking stuff. I'm only going to play a little bit of the next song, just so I can say something too about it, but because it's another aspect of Schumann's dissonant kind of technique here. I'm going to stop there. One of the other reasons I'm playing these songs for you, aside from that they're miniature versions of what you're going to hear so that it makes it very easy to comprehend, is that Schumann wrote all these songs before he wrote any of his chamber music. And Schumann was a literary person. The texts help build his style. His chamber music is like poetry. He said that himself. His father was a literary agent, and Schumann himself grew up surrounded by literature. He thought he was going to be a writer. In fact, he felt he was equally talented in writing and music. And of course, he was one of the first great music critics. I know saying great music critic is... all right, he was one of the first important... Okay, he was one of the only poetic music critics. He was the only poetic music critic. Okay. He was the only good... Okay, never mind. So anyway, the thing about this is when it starts... It's just like what you heard here, because this chord should go, or it could go, or, I mean, actually that's what you really expect. But this is what happens. It shifts immediately, and the whole thing is down a half step from what you thought. So it's the wrong chord, and it drops a half step. He uses that chord all the time. It's in this piece too, when he does this. That's exactly the same chord, and it also doesn't do, or it does just what happens here. It drops the same exact half step. It's the same technique. A diminished chord, a chord that out of the blue, you don't know what key a chord is. When you hear a diminished chord by itself at the beginning, you can't possibly know what key you're in. It's impossible. And then he lowers one note, I know what key it is, and then he lowers it again, and you don't know what the key is. So it is, he's not doing it to trip you up. You know, obviously nobody listens like that. But it's like a big romantic sigh, because you start with this unknown chord, you can't tell where you are, it drops, you feel like you know it, and then it drops again. So it's a physical, literal sigh. Then, just to finish this little song, because this chord was used that way, your ear wants. Now I know your ear doesn't actually want, so don't talk to me about that. Your brain wants through your cochlea. It wants you to use that chord the way it was meant to be, the way you expected it to be later. So he does. So you get, there's the chord again, but this time it moves up into that key that we didn't get. And then it slips back down. And why does he do it? Is he just playing around? It's the text again. He builds his imagination from words. So what happens is the text is, it's a beautiful summer morning and go into the garden and the flowers are talking. So when the flowers talk, it goes into this other key that was hinted at, and then he says, but I remained quiet. And when he says that he remained quiet, it drops back down to the other key. So the flowers are in an alternative universe harmonically. They really, truly are. So he uses the wormhole of this chord. I know he didn't know any physics, but he was a lawyer, sort of. I mean, he went to law school, but he didn't go to any classes. So I guess he wasn't, he didn't go to any classes. It's true. I looked that up, I checked it over, no classes. But that's okay. He was a composer. So, the key of the human being right as the flowers talk, the key of the flowers back to the human being. It's incredible. So now let's get back to the actual piece at hand. You guys recuperated from all this? Okay. I mean, can you still play is what I mean. Okay. I'd like to just hear the big tune the way it's supposed to go, just with cello and piano once. Here's the big tune that comes next. Wait. Play the other version of the tune. Oh well, I had to. It's not quite the real tune. This is, if you know the piece, let this do something to you, what's about to happen, and if you don't, in a way, the better, all the better. Okay, here's a slightly altered version of the tune. Okay, now before I say anything, let's hear the real thing for a moment, and then we'll see what the changes are. There are more of them than you might think. Okay. Or fewer. Go ahead. Now, obviously, it's the shape of the tune is different. What I did, though, is I did not change a single note of the cello melody. I changed a few octaves, okay? So could you just play the cello alone, play a little bit of the real thing, and then we'll put it back the way I want, because this is very important, because what Schumann is doing is taking a very simple line, of scale-like line, and shifting some octaves around. And the reason it's important to know is because in the middle of the piece, there's a chorale where he puts them back and disguises the whole thing. That's not generally well known. Okay, so let's try that again. The real, no, we just heard the real one. Yours. Yeah, okay. I have an idea. No, I have an idea. You play the fake version, and I'll play the real one on the piano. Because it's not going to be dissonant, it's just be different octaves. It's almost exactly the same, a few little rhythmic differences. But by not having those leaps of these, which you can call octave displacements. Now, you've been coming to these lectures, which, yes, you have. Those displacements we talked about in rhythm, here are displacements in octaves. So he could have just written a scale. Who knows? Maybe he thought of it that way first. There's no way to know. I don't have a sketch for this. But then he opened them up. By opening them up, they become much more romantic. So we got that, but what about the piano part? Now, could you play the piano part the way I wrote it? And maybe you should play the cello part incredibly quietly, and you play the piano part louder, which is, you wouldn't want to hear it this way, but listen to the keyboard part. I took a lot of notes out of it. Try it again. Okay, that's enough. In order to move on, if you just play the way Schumann wrote it, the first four measures, that will be enough to make the point. Just the piano, sorry. Now listen to this. Okay, do you hear that dissonance there? It never resolves. He doesn't resolve it. And let's slow it down, the cello and the piano, the way Schumann wrote it, very slowly. Listen for how many dissonances there are. It is incredibly dissonant, and things don't resolve. Some of them do, but a lot of them don't. Let's hear that again. The whole tune very slowly so we can hear how dissonant it really is. Okay, now, just to drive the point home, when the cello does this, the piano does not resolve. Now, I'm playing it in an ugly way to bring out what that is. So they have to play it very, very smoothly, because if it were not written by Schumann, and we didn't love it already, it would be considered full of dissonances. In fact, they mount up. Now let's go on to the next. By the way, the structure of this is very simple. It's just a set of variations on either side of a chorale, which is also a variation, very subtle variation. So let's go on to the next phrase where the violin enters, and let's have everybody enter. So bar, whatever that is, where cantabile, the cello's going down to the cadence. Okay? Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Okay, now it is beautiful. I just want to drive home how dissonant it is. It was, at the time, probably extremely difficult for a lot of people to listen to. And you know who said that it was? Schumann. Not just that piece, but his music in general. Here is a review of his style by himself. Now, why did he do that? Well, you know, I told you he really loved being a writer. And he started his own journal, music journal. And the music journal, he wrote for it for 10 years. And he wrote about everybody's music, all his rivals, all the people who might become less or more famous than he, doing exactly what he was doing. But he wrote brilliantly about everybody. And often, you probably know about this, he had these two pseudonyms who were opposing in nature. Florestan, who was an ebullient, highly active, kind of virtuoso writer and somebody who loved virtuosic music and difficult things and exciting music. And he had Eusebius, who liked calmer, more subtle, more poetic writing. Of course, they were both him. And in this case, he writes a review of himself as himself, saying that it was recommended to him by Florestan and Eusebius. But you know, it's interesting. When my daughter was 4, she studied with a teacher who had this great technique of saying, there are 2 people in the room with you who are violinists. They were invisible. One was Starscht, which is a great name. The other was Janet. So my daughter would play, and she would say, what did Starscht think of that? And she'd say, oh, well, Starscht thought my bow was crooked. Things like that, you know. And she always knew what Starscht and Janet. So Eusebius and Florestan is very similar. It's a wonderful imaginative way of getting going. So this is what he said about his music. The predominant earnestness and passion are incompatible with the expectations of a contemporary concert audience, which does not want to be deeply moved and has neither the capacity nor the sense of consecration required to grasp and comprehend such harmonies and ingenious obscurities. A proper appreciation of such things is restricted to ears and temperaments attuned to the loftier inflections of artistic heroes. Much of the harmonization employs dissonances whose subsequent resolution brings balm only to an experienced ear. Anticipations and suspensions, I'll define those for the 3 of you, I'm not sure what that is. Anticipations and suspensions, whose development often becomes clear only after the 2nd or 3rd bar, are frequently harsh, although justified. In order not to be disturbed or abused by them, one must be an experienced musician who senses in advance and anticipates how every contradiction resolves itself. I think of a statesman who, amidst the tumultuous revelry of a court ball, seems to be focusing his eyes and ears on everything, and yet actually concentrates on those few in whom he has a diplomatic interest. That's quite a metaphor. I think I'll send that one to the New Yorker. But anyway, basically the idea that he understood the dissonance and felt that you need to listen really well. So we are in the opposite situation. We hear this and we think it's beautiful and not so dissonant now because of the world has changed. So I'm trying to draw your attention to how dissonant it actually is so that you can appreciate the beauty of the dissonance. What else are you going to do in a lecture? Okay, so basically, let's take a look now at what they just played, just violin and cello. And let's play it very slowly. And when you hear a dissonant note between the 2 of you, just let us hear it for a moment, you know, maybe a little vibrato or something. So starting where the violin comes in and the cello comes in a little bit later. Or no, you can play your cadence, just where you were. Yeah, and did you hear the piano dissonance just at the last moment there? So it is so beautiful. The dissonances are really bittersweet, but there are more of them in a phrase than you would expect. Now, after we've heard all these displacements, and octave displacements, the piano does an entire variation. It's accompanied by the strings, but an entire variation where the tune is staggered and interrupted by a lot of notes. It's all syncopated. Let's just hear the piano alone once do this little section. It's a wonderful set of syncopations. The tune is in there, and it's not obvious, and it's not always in there. It's very subliminal. I wrote out to help Michael do this because it really is a pain in the neck. If you can play just the right hand, the syncopated hand, and he's going to accent slightly or play slightly louder where the tune is. It's not easy to do. It's kind of disturbing. Let's give it a shot. That's why I'm making him do this. Okay, now, already it's confusing, but hold on. The tune here. Now, play that and try to hear that tune in here. Not easy. It's there, and it continues like that. This, you have, can you play both of these at the same time? Okay, do you hear how it's fitting in there? That was good, very good. It's kind of disturbing. It might be used as a neurological test to see how your cochlea is doing. Anyway, it's quite disturbing, but I think you got the point. Now, after that, we get a chorale. And the chorale, let's hear the first phrase of the chorale. And you're not going to be able to find the tune in there, but because it's almost impossible, but it's there, and I'll show you where it is. Yeah, the second beat is good. Okay, now, first of all, the tune is rhythmically there because the tune goes dim ba ti dum bim bum bim. So this goes. They said start on the second beat, right? Because the first beat is and then ba. So it already is there rhythmically. Ba. But more than that, do you remember how I had the cello remove all the octave displacements? I did that because in the chorale, if you take out the octave displacements, you start to hear that the tune is there. It's still disguised even more. By the way, disguising things was Schumann. Schumann loved to do that. He had cryptic messages in his music. He quoted themes from Clara, and she quoted themes from him, and they buried each other's names in the music, but it's all the time. And so burying the theme in there is just normal. So we have, this is the violin. Why don't you play the violin part, and I will try to bring out the tune. Okay, you see it's there with a few passing notes and the octaves are brought down. Now, if you think this is extreme, it is, but this is the whole point. He writes, throughout his music, he likes to bury things in a secret way. It's very easy to do. He doesn't care that anyone find it, except probably Clara. And there are two composers, both Brahms and Schumann, who are always sending messages to Clara through their music. And she also sends some messages to Robert. Whether anyone else hears it is really beside the point. And it's totally unnecessary. But that's why sometimes they're so cryptic, and you think, is that really true? But of course it is. It's fun for them, and maybe fun for us. Now, the next thing he does after the chorale is entwine the tune in a series of very simple sounding but very dissonant, almost like a vine wrapping itself around the tune. So let's just hear the viola and the violin for a moment. This is, you know where it is, tempo 1. Now, we don't have to slow that down, but if I did, you'd hear, because you can hear, there are so many little dissonances, but they're beautiful. But they don't resolve in the normal way. So part of what's interesting here is that if he were in a school, which he wasn't, if he were studying, all of these dissonances would have to be resolved in some normal way. In fact, even today, for some reason, music is often, it's always taught, where you learn the voice leading of the Baroque period first. And then you learn chorales, which are basically what Bach would write, like what Schumann was sort of referring to in the chorale section. And you learn rules that Bach never knew about what not to do and how to resolve things. And then you look to see for the rest of your studying that no one does this. And they go, oh, look, it's being broken by so-and-so, or Schumann's not doing it, Schubert didn't do that either, Liszt didn't do it either, look, Beethoven broke all the rules. Because those rules, they didn't know any of them. But they've been taught for so long, and they still are taught that way. And it comes down to what I would call the musical equivalent of standardized testing. My theme. So that you always think that these composers are breaking rules, and so Schumann's dissonances break every rule that was never there. But there are tendencies and traditions in voice leading. If they're taught that way, it's a little different. And he does ride on the edge of acceptability. Interestingly, compared to Wagner's harmonies, these are not that dissonant in the long run, but moment to moment, they're more dissonant than Wagner. Because Wagner's dissonances are these long, spread out, kind of structural things. You don't know where you're going, so it's dissonant. In other words, if you want to make a metaphor, you're in the dark and there's just vague light some here and there, so as you walk, it's the whole room that's kind of dissonant because you don't know where you are. That's Wagner. Schumann, you open the door and a pail falls on your head. But it feels good. Because it was rubber. Okay. Now, let's do the next little section of this where the violin tune is wrapped around by the piano, and the viola. We need everybody, because when the viola comes in, imitating, copying the tune, there's an unbelievable couple of dissonances. How do you guys like the A-flat G section, the two notes on top of each other? Do you know what I'm talking about? Let me just have the violin and the viola play where they, just alone, and let's hear very slowly, the violin and the viola from the second where they do this cantabile thing. And listen how dissonant this is. Wait. It happens twice in a row, and they hear the dissonant note, and then they just trade. That's all they're doing, because the violin's going down, the viola's going up. But it's the same notes, so it goes like, Rah! Let's do the same thing again. It's just amazing. Yeah, and we'll go a little further. Okay, so you see how dissonant that is? It's almost bizarre. The harmonies do help, but the harmonies are also, in the piano, left hand is playing the nice, clear harmonies, but the right hand is doing this filigree with the vine wrapping around it. So the dissonances are even more intense. So let's hear that duet with everybody, the way it's written, starting at that section with the piano 16ths. Okay, great. Beautiful, beautiful. Now, by the way, each variation, they're basically trading places with what they've done, but it gives you a new slant on the dissonances. Now, remember, he was not only a romantic, but he was also a very troubled person with severe depressions, and he was bipolar. I mean, there's almost no doubt. Now, it's always hard to diagnose somebody from the past, but in this case, it's not so hard. And that's why I recommend you read Minds on Fire by K. Jameson Redfield if you want to really get into Schumann that way, because it's a really, really very, very powerful case. And she's not the only one. It's just the most elaborate exposition of this situation. But also, he wrote a lot of letters, and so did Clara Schumann. In fact, in a 6-month period, I want to get the right number, when they first got to know each other, in 1836, during just a few months, not even 6 months, they wrote 275 letters to each other. These were not emails. These were letters. Now, here's a letter from 1833. And Schumann really, at this point, he just had a cold, but he was also depressed. He talks about bandages. We don't know why, because he just had a cold, as far as we can tell from this time. But this is a letter that's one of the most famous letters from Robert to Clara. Dear and good Clara, I want to know whether and in what manner you are living. There's nothing else in the letter. I hardly wish that you may still remember me, for I'm wasting away visibly more and more every day, and am growing into a withered, leafless beanstalk. By the way, he's 23 at the time. And he was actually physically okay. The doctor has even forbidden me to yearn excessively. I mean, imagine a prescription like that. Then he says, for you, that is, as it's too fatiguing. But today I tore off the bandages from my wound and laughed straight in the doctor's face when he tried to keep me from writing. Yes, I threatened to attack him with my fever and infect him, unless he quietly complied, and he did so. It was not my intention, however, to tell you all of this, but something altogether different, namely a request which you must grant me, since now no chain of sparks whatever draws us together and reminds us of one another. I have formed a sympathetic proposal. Tomorrow night at 11 sharp, I'll play the Adagio from Chopin's Variations and will think very hard of you, in fact of you exclusively. You please do the same so that we may see each other and meet in spirit. The place where our doubles will meet is probably above the Thomas fortune. If there's a full moon, I recommend it as a letter mirror. I hope very much for an answer. If you won't do it, and a string snaps on your piano at the 12th hour, it is I. And it is I with all my heart. Isn't that amazing? That's the same kind of person who would write this music, clearly. Now, there are a few other things I want to say about this, but what's great also is that the way he entered this movement, the strange way he entered it, is he gets out of it in a strange way too. The end of this movement, he actually starts to have a dream of the next movement. Now, Beethoven did that, not very often, but in his late works, Beethoven started linking movements in strange ways. The most famous dream in Beethoven's music of the next movement, like a vision of the next movement, is the Emperor Concerto. The slow movement of the Emperor Concerto, which I don't have a recording, but just easy to find, has a slow motion. You don't know it by heart, do you? You do? Yes, okay, wait a second. So it has, good. This is, do you know what comes right before that? Okay, I push him. No, but this is from the end of the slow movement, and then it goes into the next move. So here's the dreamy part. Oh, you might have it. That's what an iPad, oh, he's going to get it on his iPad, okay. Technology. So we'll get to that in a second. But in this movement, the last movement it's exactly like what Beethoven did, and maybe he was thinking of it, because in slow motion, the ideas start to form that become the last movement, and then the last movement happens. I think he probably was thinking of Beethoven when he did that. It's also the same key. That matters a lot to these guys. Did you find it already? Great. Okay, let's hear a little bit of the music that leads into. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Okay, now that probably inspired this. Let's do the end of the slow movement from the a tempo and go into just the very first phrase of the finale. Right, so there you have it. It's the same idea exactly, and it might have been an homage or Beethoven, but who knows? I would think in his circle of friends, everyone knew that that was an homage to Beethoven, and they liked that. There are things in this piece that probably are an homage to Schubert. In fact, we were talking about that earlier. Maybe you should play just a little bit of that piano accompaniment at the tempo one where it sounds like Schubert. Now, this is a very, very simple accompaniment, but Schubert's accompaniments to his songs were so distinctive that they're recognizable even though they're kind of trivial sometimes, because they're not actually trivial. They're simple, 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 but they are memorable. So this accompaniment. Okay, that may sound like anybody would do that, but Schubert, all I can say is it's a Schubert thing. Now, if you think it's too much to have a stream of consciousness, I will show you how easily you actually do have such a thing. What piece is this? Für Elise, isn't it? No, it is. And what about this? Moonlight Sonata. Very good. If you knew it was Moonlight Sonata and you didn't think you have perfect pitch, think again. Because without it being on the right pitch, you wouldn't know that it was the Moonlight Sonata. So go home and think about that and get your cochlea examined. All right. I was just in Salzburg with a cochlea surgeon. So that's why I keep thinking of the cochlea. He showed us how it's done. It was very messy. Okay. Now, one of the things about the year of chamber music is that, like most composers in the history of the world, if they're about to embark on something new, they do a study of the great music. Schumann was, like in everything he did, very manic about that. So right before he wrote his 3-string quartets, he studied all the Beethoven quartets and the Haydn quartets and the Mozart quartets, but that's not all he did. And the thing about it that's strange is he didn't do that gradually over many years. He did it all at once. He had tried to write some quartets a few years before, and he didn't like them. But then he buckled down and did his fast study of these pieces. I think that for Schumann, to just turn the pages and look at the music was probably an intense study of the music. Then, he also held chamber music evenings in his house of things that he wanted to hear, because he didn't have YouTube. So he needed to invite all these people over so that he could find out what this music sounded like. And he not only had the big stars of the day, like Cherubini and Spohr, not only their string quartets, but he also invited people who we don't hear too much about today, who were very close friends of his and whose respect he really, truly had. One of his best friends, who was an excellent composer and who was Dutch and became the conductor of quite a few orchestras in Germany, and then went back to Amsterdam and became extremely famous there. His name was Jean Verhulst. Okay? Now, he's also called Johann Verhulst, depending where he was at the time. Verhulst, Verhulst. Now, I was wondering, there was a long list of composers that he studied and invited to his house. Some of them, I could find nothing. That shows you how bad things are for those people, nothing. Today, you know how easy it is to find something? But Verhulst has had a resurgence in the last couple of years because there was a Dutch string quartet wandering around, they said, we need to play Dutch music, and let's uncover famous Dutch composers. And one of them lived on a street called Verhulst Street. And he said, who's Verhulst? I heard that he was a composer. So they looked it up, and he was. And then they found out that he had studied with Mendelssohn, was a close friend of Schumann, and they started playing his music everywhere. So this is actually a live recording of the Utrecht String Quartet. Only one of them is actually Dutch, but that's okay. And they're playing a little bit of Verhulst. So the reason I'm playing some of this for you is that this was a composer who was very famous at the time, that Schumann respected, and who Schumann invited into his home to hear this music. And you'd be surprised, or maybe not, that it sounds a lot like that world, and it's quite good too. This is being streamed, so it might take a second. Streaming problem. Give it another second or two. Well, okay. Let's not give it another second or two. But you can look up Verhulst. This was from a YouTube performance. It's beautiful music. It's not as complex as Schumann, but then again, very few people were. I mean, there was just a few great composers of the period, of course. So I just recommend hearing that. Now, I think we need to discuss the one weird thing in the cello part, which is that the cello is asked to tune a string down a whole step in the middle of the piece. What do you think about that, Nick?
Well, it's not our favorite thing to do, but we do it. We make it work.
So you already have it down now, right?
I do.
So, but you have to.
He writes a specific place to tune down, which is during the viola solo.
Of course.
So,
why did
whether or not that's a viola joke is an interesting question. But I actually do it before the third movement because I like violas.
That's really funny that it's true. It says right during the viola solo. Amazing. Okay, are you going to play it back? Play the low B flat since you're there now. All right, and that's lower than a cello. That's what it should be. And now you're going to have to put it back up to play the first part of the movement, right?
I don't do that. I actually transpose.
You transpose. Okay. How common is that? Do you know?
I'm not sure.
Any comments about that out there? Common?
I think some people do it, and some people.
Okay.
Well, I once heard a performance that was at a church with some windows open, and right at the spot where Schumann writes the low B flat, I heard a plane going over right on the B flat that needs to be heard. So I guess if you just have a plane fly over, you can work it out.
I think I'm having more influence on these people than I intend to. Now, before we hear them play this incredible movement, the word romantic. Schumann is often talked about as being the most romantic composer of all time. There are lots of reasons. Suffering the way he did is considered romantic. This is not good. I mean, this is not a healthy thing. That somebody needs to suffer, then it helps him be romantic is I don't want to even go there, but people like that. The idea of the suffering artist really emerged very strongly in the 19th century, and Schumann was one of the primary examples. I mean, you know that he tried to kill himself, he was institutionalized, and he died basically of a kind of syphilis, but he really was battling depression and had these manic swings quite often, enough, and there were so many in his family and other suicides in his family, not even just one. His suicide, in fact, there's a note here about what happened. Yeah, here's the diary of a friend. This is one of the ways we know about this. Schumann snuck out of his bedroom at 2 in the afternoon wearing felt slippers and headed straight for the Rhine, jumping into the river from the middle of the bridge. Luckily, he was noticed at the entrance to the bridge, and indeed because he offered his handkerchief as a pledge to the bridge because he had no money for the toll. Fortunately, several fishermen who had been observing this odd transaction came along with a little boat. Immediately after he leapt, they saved him. Once in the boat, he tried to jump into the water again, but the fishermen prevented him. The trip home must have been dreadful. He was transported by 8 men and followed by a group of people. It was carnival season, and they amused themselves at his expense. So back to the word romantic. Musically speaking, romantic means that there's enough dissonance, and not just note-to-note dissonance, but structural dissonance and lack of, there's less formal rigor, because it's more in the character of the piece. It unfolds in its own way. And there's less stability. That's another kind of dissonance. In other words, I've done this before, it's very visual. If this is classical, then this is romantic. It's less stable. Also, if this is consonant, then this is dissonant. Because what dissonant means in music, don't try this, it's very painful. No, what dissonance in music means is the need to resolve. That's what dissonance means. This has no need of resolution. So if you were to, what I sometimes do, but I'm not going to do it now because it's complicated, put a book on the piano. As you push it towards the edge, it becomes more and more dissonant. And when it's actually at the point where it could go either way, that's extremely dissonant. So the resolution would be to fall to the floor. If it doesn't fall to the floor, that's a deceptive cadence. It's hard to do that with a book, but in music, it's okay. If you think of it this way, we know that that's not a force of gravity doing that. That's warped space, right? Thanks to Einstein. So that actually what a composer does is keep warping the harmonic space so that things have their own gravity. Ooh, I like that. No, but it's true, that the shape of the piece in romantic music is molded in new ways so that what's dissonant and what's consonant, what's tension and what's release changes. And especially in Germany, that tension becomes more and more and more to the point where tonality, which you want to think of as the gravity of it all, disappears. So that's kind of a way of looking at it. But here's Schumann on the subject of Romanticism. He's writing about Stefan Heller, another composer who was quite good, not great like Schumann or Mendelssohn, but really quite good. And he's being reviewed by Schumann. This is Schumann talking. I am sick to death of the word romanticist, although I have not spoken it 10 times in my life. And yet, if I were to give our young seer a title, that is what I would call him. I hasten to add that there is about him none of that vague nihilistic disorder behind which some seek the romantic. That's Schumann talking. It's pretty intense. Okay, speaking of nihilism, let's hear you guys play this. I don't know what that connection was, but it feels good. Okay. Oh, but before we do, one more thing. This is important. Because, you know, Michael, he's really, he needs some instruction on piano playing. Don't you, Michael? Are you going to be okay with this? I'm going to, would it be all right if I got some advice in piano playing from Friedrich Wieck? Now, Friedrich Wieck was Clara Schumann's father. And she was also he was also Robert Schumann's piano teacher. That's how Robert and Clara met. He moved into his piano teacher's house, saw the daughter who was 9 years younger, and that was eventually they got married. Against the will of Friedrich Wieck, very much so. They had to go to court and everything. So it would have been good if Robert Schumann had finished his law degree, but they won anyway. So here are some cautions And I want you to pay attention to these, Michael. These are from Friedrich Wieck to all pianists. I warn pianists, and others also, in playing, against any showy or unsuitable display. Why should you wish to attract attention and to create an effect by foppishness and all sorts of grimaces, or by curious and marvelous exhibitions of virtuosoship? You have only to play musically and beautifully, and to deport yourselves with modesty and propriety. Direct your whole attention to the business in hand, that is, to your performance, and endeavor to secure for it the interest of the public. The public, who are, this is for you, easily rendered inattentive. We want no more public performances from eccentric geniuses. Do not devote yourself exclusively to pieces calculated to show your skill. Why desire to show off your power in octave passages, trills, facility in skips, unprecedented stretches, or other fantastic feats? You only produce weariness, satiety, disgust, and at least you make yourself ridiculous. Play good music in a musical and rational manner. The public are tired of hearing potpourris made up of odds and ends, tedious etudes, rhapsodies, fantasies without fancy in them, dismal, motionless, and endless, cheap, silly cadences that mean nothing. Learn to understand the age in which you live. Do not make yourselves ridiculous by inventions in piano playing. This is a great one. I mean, for example, one of the most foolish affectations of modern times. You try to vibrato on a note. Can you demonstrate that? Good. Nothing happens. Just as violinists and cellists, unfortunately, are inclined to do. Do not expose yourselves to the derision of every apprentice in piano manufacturing. Have you no understanding of the construction of a piano? You play upon it, or some of you have stormed upon it for the last 10 years, and yet you have not taken pains to obtain even a superficial acquaintance with its mechanism. The hammer, which by its stroke upon the string has produced a sound, falls immediately when the tone resounds. And after that, you may caress the key, which has set the hammer in motion. You may fidget around on it as much as you please, stagger up and down over it in your intoxicated passion, and no more sound is to come from it through all your trembling and quivering. It is only the public who are quivering with laughter. I think that's enough of his advice. Can you handle that? Okay, here we go. Thank you all.